Let's say you want to produce an automobile. The planner wants to produce an automobile. It's a production function for an automobile. And he has all the information. Now, there are many different ways to produce automobiles. Okay? You can use a lot of labor, as was the case prior to the mass production of automobiles in the United States, before 1914. You'd have 6 or 7 craftsmen in a small blacksmith shop. You'd have a very small area. And they would produce all the parts themselves and then assemble the machine, assemble the automobile, and then sell it. Okay? So you had a lot of labor and few machines. After Henry Ford introduced the model of the meatpacking industry, which had a moving production line, when he introduced the assembly line in 1914, all of that changed. Okay? You had a lot of equipment. You had a huge factory, a lot of machinery compared to labor. So there are many different ways in between to produce automobiles. There's a Kia plant that's 20 miles from here. There's like 3 cars in the parking lot, even though it's, plant goes on for a mile or something. It's all run by robots. Okay? Some guys come in, push a few buttons on the computer in the beginning, and the car is assembled. Okay? So you can use a lot of capital and very little labor. What's the best way to... How do you know what technology to use? How do you know how many cars to produce? So let's say that the socialist planner knows he needs to produce an automobile. He needs a certain amount of steel, so P tons of steel. Add that to Q hours of labor, and just forget the handwritten stuff for a moment. R hours of unskilled labor, Q hours of machine time, S hours of engineering labor, T square feet of factory space, U kilowatt hours of electricity, V hours of managerial labor, and you get one automobile. Okay? Doesn't matter what the numbers are. They're correct. Okay? Socialism never had a problem with technology. I mean, they sent a man into space before the United States did. Okay? So they didn't have a problem with technology. They had a problem with knowing, with rationally allocating resources. So under socialism, should you produce that automobile? Or do those factors combined have higher values to consumers or to the planner himself in producing, some of them in producing bicycles, others in producing a house? In other words, should we produce the automobile or should we produce more bicycles or more motorcycles or other things that people want? Let's say workout gyms, health clubs. Okay? Should we produce this factory, let's say, that produces automobiles, or should we put up 500 health clubs, which we could have used the resources for? They don't know. Because how can you add up the cost of production? Even if there was a price for cars, even if laborers were paid, which they were in the Soviet Union, and the price for cars were 100,000 rubles, what could you compare that to? Can you add up tons of steel, hours of machine time, square feet of space, kilowatt hours? There's no common denominator. There's no way of knowing your cost of production. If you don't know your cost of production, everything is chaotic. It's calculational chaos. Okay? So what Mises basically said is, no, we're not saying that people can't allocate goods, in very simple production processes. But once you have an industrial economy with millions of different types of factors of production, no human mind can figure out all the values of those factors of production, given that they can be combined in almost an infinite number of combinations to produce an infinite number of different kinds of goods in quality and quantities. Okay? That's the problem you would face. If you right now, the commons are of the United States, all prices were wiped out, you owned everything throughout the whole world, or let's say throughout the US, and were cut off from the rest of the world, what would you produce? Okay? Well, you could say I would give orders to produce the same things and do it in the same way that we're doing now. But as we'll see, Mises pointed out that that's, of course, an economy without change. People's technology changes, people's tastes change, and so on. That's not a solution. Okay, so there was a great famine in the USSR, which you may have heard about, which occurred in the 1980s. But the Soviet Union has a lot of arable land. Okay? It's a very productive, technically productive agricultural sector. And yet, people were starving in the midst of all this, And yet there was grain in the fields. There were rusty tractors, though, that were sitting in the fields because they didn't have enough diesel fuel, and because there weren't sufficient workers to run them because they were there producing more tractors that were going to rust in the fields. So the resources were misallocated. People were starving in the midst of plenty. Okay? No one was harvesting the wheat. Another example is that when houses were built in the Soviet Union, many of them, people noticed, didn't have roofs on them, didn't have any roofs. And the reason was that there weren't enough small building nails, which are used in roofing. The reason why there wasn't was because the Soviet Union had a particular system of trying to allocate resources called gross output planning. And the agency was a ghost plan. And basically what that was they would tell each industry. There would be a commissar of an industry, and then under that industry there would be a number of different firms with different managers. And they tell them, we need so many tons of building nails. Okay? And they would give them an output plan that they had to meet, a target. If you didn't meet it, you went to Siberia. Okay? So there was, if you did meet it, you got a big bonus. So of course the whole system became what? A system of mutual lying. Right? Because you didn't want to go to Siberia and you did want the bonus, so you always underestimated, as the manager, how much you could produce. Now, the people at Ghost Plan knew you were lying. Okay? So they would always give you a bigger target. Okay? Because they're figuring you're lying, and so the next year you'd actually try to make it lower. Okay? So it'd be a mutual lying back and forth. But even given that, even if they weren't lying, the easiest way to produce building nails, if they're specified in terms of tons, is to simply what? Produce huge nails. Okay? So one of the famous cartoons during the Soviet era, and I can't find it online, but I remember seeing it. All right, so you have this is the commissar. He's got that big, fur hat on. This is the manager of the plant. This is a huge screw that's on this train, and he says, "Well, comrade, I've met my target for this year." Okay, so you had all these huge nails, which weren't good for roofing, but you needed roofing nails. Now, under a capitalist system, we had a market, of course. If there was a scarcity of the smaller nails, the price would go up, and there'd be big profits, and you'd shift from producing larger to smaller. There was another incident in which Khrushchev, the Soviet prime minister in the 50s and into the early 60s, there used to be Soviet watchers. They would watch what was said at any of these meetings. And at one meeting, he referred to the fact that many comrades were being killed by chandeliers falling from the ceilings of their dachas, their luxury vacation homes. Well, the thing was, the chandelier industry was given a weight target to meet. So the chandeliers were really heavy. They had lead in them and stuff. And so they're falling pulling the ceilings down and, crushing people and stuff. And Khrushchev didn't like that. Women's clothing, there was a thriving black market in women's clothing, tight jeans and so on, because everything looked like a huge burlap sack. Because, again, it was yards of output that they were trying to, that they would judge the industry by, yards of clothing produced. Now, they could change that, but it's still difficult to give a quality target. Very difficult, and to tell them how much of each to do, so that you got all of these sorts of problems under socialism.